felt the need to kind of preface the land acknowledgement by saying words are insufficient. However, I think it's important in our cultural moment to talk about how words are actually important. The truth is important. We are living in a moment where the government is eliminating histories by eliminating words on official websites. And so words and language are important. So here's the land acknowledgement. The University of Oregon is located on Kalapuya Ali'i, the traditional indigenous homelands of the Kalapuya people. Following treaties between 1851 and 1855, the Kalapuya people were dispossessed of their indigenous homeland by the United States government and forcibly removed to the coastal reservation in Western Oregon. Today, descendants are citizens of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde Community of Oregon and the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians. And they continue to make important contributions to their communities at UO and across the land we now call Oregon and around the world. We express our respect for all the federally recognized as tribes, tribal nations of Oregon. It is my pleasure today to introduce Adi Melinciliano. I'm going to screw that up. Did I? Okay, I already did. It's my great pleasure to mispronounce our wonderful visiting artist, Adi. I came across her work. I've been teaching a class called Emerging Technologies for the last, in that class I've been teaching artificial intelligence for the last 5 or 6 years. It's changed a lot over time, but about 3 years ago, really things changed radically where suddenly we had interfaces where you could just write in texts and it would generate images. And in that context, I came across Adi's work. And it was wonderfully important to me and important to be able to share it with the students because it took this kind of problematic state, right, without kind of smartly recognizing the biases that are cooked into the AIs, but also insisting on the importance of play within that space. It was kind of wonderful work to share with my students and actually work that inspired how I approach teaching artificial intelligence. So it's a special pleasure for me personally to have her here. Adi's work spans the exploration of the collective subconscious with AI, archiving of ancestral memories through sound and dance, and the creation of speculative futures through celestial botany. Adi's practice is deeply interdisciplinary, revealing the interconnectedness of fields that are often seen as separate. She has exhibited internationally from the Dubai Museum of the Future to the Studio Museum in Harlem. She has taught and lectured at institutions such as NYU, Hunter College, Parsons, and Pratt. She has also served as a creative technologist at Google's Creative Lab. She is the founder of Afrotechopia, a social institution that reimagines the possibilities at the nexus of art, technology, and culture. Under this framework, she recently published the book, Black Metal, a kitchen table art book born from collaboration between Afrotechopia, MIT Media Lab, and NYU's ITP program. Her work continues to push the boundaries of emerging technologies and cultural narratives. Please welcome me in welcoming Adi Melinciliano. I'm so sorry.
Thank you. Thank you, John. Hello. Can you hear me? Great. Adi Melinciliano, that's how to pronounce it. Yes. But thank you for the intro, very honoring. And very excited to join everyone here on your campus and to share some of my work. I was telling Colin I have 110 slides, so I'm gonna speak very quickly, but all these parts of my practice are kind of like my little babies and it's hard to not include them, so we're gonna go on a whole journey. But I want to start off with this quote that I really love by Joseph Campbell that says, "The privilege of a lifetime is being who you are." And I find art to be an amazing tool for self-discovery, self-expression, and have really leaned into the importance of cherishing who you are and how you exist in the world, and allowing yourself to be exactly, who you are. So we're going to go on a journey, as I mentioned. My work has studied a lot of different things, from starting off studying, like the past 3 years, what I've been exploring is a bit of studying society, as Colin mentioned, with AI. That then guided me to study myself, my own identity, studied my interiority, speculative histories, entanglements of consciousness, sensorial catalysts for ancestral memories, to even archiving of the future. And the way that I've organized this is kind of like we're going to watch a movie, a little life movie of exploring how I've bridged all of these different ideas together and kind of broken them down into themes. So the first theme is studying society with AI. And so this was one of the first few pieces that I made with AI, generative AI. And I created this because I was interested in just playing around with it and seeing what it did. And I felt like a great way to do it in a concise way was just, let me just upload a headshot that I have. So we see in the top left. And let me add words into this machine, just using my image and a word, and seeing how this tool would adjust my image based off the word. And so we would see things like, if I said scientist, it would age me a bit. If I said Gothic, it would add, traditional Gothic makeup. If I said aunt, it would also age me. But even at the time, I was an aunt. I've been an aunt for 3. If I said French, it would do something similar to Gothic, the red lipstick, but not as much of a heavy eye makeup. So really, I was just studying how words now have visual synonyms. And I labeled this practice computational anthropology, in that it allowed me to use technology in such a robust system as AI to study people, to study how we have existed in the world. And also understanding that AI is simply a mirror to our own societal behavior. The words that I'm using and the way that it's translating my image based off of how I use that word is a reflection of us as a group of people in this specifically Western world and our behavior online, and how it's studied that and found correlations. And so now I see that words really have this visual synonym. And none of them were really surprising, even the one that changed my both race and gender, programmer. So we see in the second to bottom row, where it turned me into this white man, because the data set is based off of, again, this Western American data set, even though actually, statistically, there are way more Asian, Indian specifically, programmers than anyone else in the rest of the world, but it's not based off that data set. So these are a bit of close-ups. My family's actually Dominican, and so to see how it had this idea that it still needed to change me even though I am. So some things it retained about me, some things it didn't. And so it's, again, this level of how it understands that word. And so a few more. Poor was really interesting. We see in the bottom towards the left. And that also made me think about, how does it translate the word poor? Does it see poor as a sympathetic word, or is it a financial poor? So there's also semantic rules that we don't get to understand as clearly because it's just visual, word to visual. But it really made me start to think a lot more critically about language, about words. And so then there's this tweet that came out around the time that I was exploring this by Andrej, who is a co-founder of OpenAI and a really impactful person in this scene of generative AI, who said the hottest new programming language is English. And this felt so succinctly representative of this moment, in that we have had tools around AI for decades, but it's because now we've converted the way that you use AI to be something that you can use language, like English words, to now allow you to program. It's very accessible and allows anyone to explore this. And so this is what creates this sort of excitement of now a lot less people are excluded. And so what does that mean in this moment? And how does that impact us? But I also want to hone in on this idea of English. The hottest new programming language is English. And English is a language. And so as I was showing in that other image of how I was thinking a lot more critically about language, since I could see the visual synonyms between words and how it impacted my identity, I started to think about, what does language do? And language really is this sort of container that gives us limits to the way that we think about the world and the way that we exist in the world. And it's only through the words that we have access to that we can understand our own culture, we can understand our own psychology, what is true and what's not true, what our values are, because we have words to allow us to express that or to even think of that as a possibility. But it's also important to think about whose language? We have so many languages around the world. And I think some of my favorite moments are finding words that exist in another language, especially the language of Japanese often has words that exist only in that culture, but does not exist in English. And for me, that's a sentiment of how that culture values that thing in a way that the English culture doesn't. And so to think about how language is completely synonymous with values and how this AI tool is used predominantly with the English language, which is coming out of an English language that's mostly the way that it's used in the United States, and how that set of values are imposed onto the CLIP model, which you see as the image behind, that's very foundational to the way that this AI tool is structured, of it pairs the English language with images, and that's how it allows me to create these visual synonyms in my work, that English language is the foundation to what we're creating, and so then the English value system is the foundation to everything that we're creating. And the demographic that even consists within that, right? So it's not just everyone that speaks English, but what kind of people speak English and what kind of people are inside of these companies that are designing these technologies. And even as someone that has worked in big tech, we can see a demographic like this easily floating online that makes it seem a lot more diverse, but this may be the demographic of who's working at Google as a whole. But most of the people that are engineers, that are creating the technologies, it doesn't look like this at all, right? So thinking very critically about who's creating this and whose perspective are we using when we use these tools. And so I continued in this direction of computational anthropology in this direction. So what I would do is I would go into the public archive and I would find all these different images that existed hundreds of years ago. And then I would use the way that the original image was captioned. So in the top right is the original image. And inside of the public archive, it would say a photograph of Benjamin Pap Singleton, 1880. And so I would only use that caption, and then I would use it inside of the AI tool and see if it could give me an image just based off that caption, similar to the original image. And this was back 3 years ago, and it was able to very well recreate the original image. But we see the differences between the original image and the other images that it creates. And again, it's reflective of the community of people that created it and what they included in the data set and did not. The original Benjamin Pap Singleton is an appearingly black man. His skin complexion is much darker than any of the other 5 that were given to me. So this tool doesn't even think it could be a possibility that an 1880 man named Benjamin Pap Singleton could be a black person, right? So what it includes and what it doesn't include. But what it does successfully do is maintain the posture of this person, their facial hair, their fashion, the sort of camera material, the photographic material. So it understands, but it also completely ignores possibility. Here's another grid that I created using the same technique, but this time I would add a layer of contextual data. So I would have my original image, and it would say men on horseback at a wedding in Ethiopia. And so I would use that as my prompt, but then I would also add other context like in National Geographic or in a Red Cross pamphlet or by African photographers or by white photographers. And the reason why I did that is because, again, words are synonyms. So now I understand the power of a word and how now, it's similar to how in Photoshop you use a color to adjust the pixels on the screen. Now I can use words to adjust the images. And understanding that each of these words, there is a history behind it. Like National Geographic, that's a brand. That's a brand that entices you to travel around the world. It wants to make locations look alluring and beautiful, so inviting. And so the images, when I would use National Geographic, often looked that way. It looked more romantic, more dreamlike, more of a place that you would want to go to. When I would say in Red Cross pamphlet, which is not included in this grid, it would make the environment look a bit more desolate. It's not a place, Red Cross pamphlet is not designed to make you want to travel to some place. It's designed to make you want to feel bad about a place and to give charity. And so the purpose of the different brands now have a visual aesthetic. Or if I said by African photographers versus by white photographers, what I noticed was if I said by African photographers, I would more often see the faces of the subject. If I said by white photographers, I would more often see the backs of the subjects. And for me, this is something I've studied as someone that loves photography and studying how photography exists around the world. And so when you have someone, this tool seemed to understand that since the original location was in Ethiopia, and if I have African photographers, that there likely would be a different relationship between the photographer and the subject than there would be if it was someone that was outside of that community, right? The level of voyeurism that exists within photography, especially travel photography. And so I could find a lot of different human behaviors by stitching ideas together and use this tool as a way to study the way that we exist in the world. And so beyond language, I also needed to understand what are other value systems. And so this is a book by Marimba Ani called Yurugu. And so this book is all about subverting the typical practice of anthropology. Anthropology, the way that it traditionally exists, is it is a practice by mostly white people going to other parts of the world and studying the way that other parts of the world work and projecting their way of understanding the world onto these other people. And what Marimba tries to do is instead flip that. And she says, I'm actually going to study you all. You're not going to study me. I'm going to figure out what's going on with you. And by doing that, she breaks down these ideas of logic in a way that kind of takes them a bit off their pedestal. And I think this was very important to me because we don't realize how much the systems that we are embedded within really control the way that we understand the world. And if we have no other alternatives, we don't even realize that we're thinking in a way that's been taught to us and that maybe things could be different. And so what Marimba does is she says, okay, this world thinks that a knower is a thinking being minus a spiritual being. But Marimba is a Black woman who is very African centered, understands that many cultures around the world, but especially in the global South and in Africa, are deeply spiritual people. And that is incredibly important in knowledge systems. And so she brings that back in. And she does that through a variety of different ways. Even bringing in the Western world's heavy reliance on Plato and the Platonic system and all these different ways that we've designed our epistemology to very much sever our relationships to the rest of the world and knowledge systems that exist in the rest of the world and other parts of the world and center back those different ways of thinking. And so I embedded all these different things, and I was commissioned by the New School's Veritas Center to write an essay on this. Since I'm exploring AI, but I'm also being very critical of it, of what are our blind spots, and don't just take this for granted and as truth, but let's think about this tool and what it means. And so in doing that, I really started to think a lot about, well, what are vehicles for contemporary Western intelligence? What is required for this to exist at such a dominant way around the world? And it requires, again, this idea of a language. That's what allows it to be socialized outside of our inner world experience and now to the outer world. It has this metric of what is considered intelligent and what is not. It has this idea of modernity where it completely dismisses everything that's happened in the past and says that's primitive and that's not intelligent. And it needs to be superior in order for it to feel valid. And so it dismisses every other idea of intelligence, says, no, you're not as good as me. I'm, supreme. And to know that this value system and way of existing is deeply embedded inside of these technology systems. And so what I say here is that our investment in AI also needs to be met with a constant inquiry as to how the technology exists within our world and to be seen more for what it is at a core understanding. Is it truly this idea of intelligence, or is it simply mimicking a behavior, a set of values, collections of norms that have now become automated, right? And so as we use these tools, we have to think about what values are existing inside these tools. And it's not to say that we can't use them, but it's just to be mindful and aware that they are, existing within it. And so that was one rabbit hole. And we have a few rabbit holes to go. And so that was me trying out AI, recognizing words as visual synonyms, whose words, though, the power of language, alternative intelligence frameworks, right, Yurugu, critiquing the tool and its limitations, and then critiquing society, understanding that this tool came from society. So I need to critique society because they created the tool. We created the tool. I'm a part of society. All of us are. Act 1, Scene 2, so studying myself with AI. And so as I did this, explorations, I started to not only be critical, but I also wanted to have fun. And so I created what's called an additional layer, a checkpoint inside of this AI tool. So we have the wider model, and then you can also create an additional layer where it personalizes that model a bit. And so I created a personalized model with my likeness, my own identity, and then I created all of these images of my own identity. And this was such an impactful moment to me, because up until that moment, I was existing in the world in a very, I would say, unself-aware way. I wasn't really paying attention to myself and the way that other people perceived me. And I was kind of just blindly living and doing whatever I wanted to do. And so by seeing all these images of myself presented in ways that I have never presented myself before, it really shook me. It made me wonder, why haven't I presented myself in these ways? Why don't I wear clothes or my hairstyle and these kinds? And some I have. Sometimes I can get a little funky with my style, but other times at that point I kind of like made myself a lot more serious. And so it really made me question my own identity of, why do I exist the way that I do? And I think that's a really important thing for everyone to consider is, why do you exist the way that you do? And understand that the reason why you exist the way that you do is because of these rules that you've given yourself. You've said, I'm this kind of person, so I have to behave like this. Or people must see me in this way, so I have to, operate in this way. But it also created a way for me to think about possibility within my life. I created all these images of me traveling around the world. And then that impacted me of my sense of travel, of my sense of possibility of existing in all these different spaces, of being all these different kind of professions, of being this supermodel that was on a jet or on a yacht and drinking champagne and living a whole very flamboyant lifestyle. And then it started to impact my memory of, at some points I started to feel like, did I experience that? And at other points it made me feel like, because I had seen an image of myself do that, I was satisfied. I didn't need to go on a yacht and drink champagne because I've seen it, And then another time, this was on Thanksgiving Day, that I actually posted these images of me and my quote unquote family enjoying Thanksgiving. And it was a bit of a troll on social media, just, having fun. But it also, what I had done at this time was also turn my entire social media presence into only AI generated images of myself. And this was before we had things like Lensa, where more people were able to do it. So this was really before most of the world could create personalized images. And I did this for a variety of reasons, but especially with social media, it was my exploration of what does it mean to be quote unquote connected online. Do we actually know what's going on in each other's lives? The images are so easy to create, but reality could often be much different than an image. And my Thanksgiving was a lot different than this one. So to think about, what we portray about ourselves online and how different it can be from reality. And yet that's our only way of really staying connected in today's world is through social media, but we're not actually connected. We really don't know what each other are going through. And so I continued to play. I did a lot of things. I was doing speculative fashion, architecture, AI portraiture, speculative music editorial, really just playing around and seeing what I could do with it. But the possibilities were infinite, and it was getting a bit overwhelming. And so what this started to do was make me think a lot more critically about creativity. This was a moment where me, as someone who has been an artist my entire life, but also have a strong affinity towards technology, I'm very comfortable between these worlds. But a lot of people aren't. A lot of artists, when they saw AI come, they felt a lot of apprehension and a lot of discomfort, reasonably. And so I wanted to take a step back and think about that, of what were the actual issues? And I think one thing that this really made me more aware of is we actually need to, what AI is doing is making us rethink our metrics for everything, but especially creativity. What does it mean to be an artist? What does it mean to be creative, right? We need a new metric system. And so I started to think about what is actually a part of the creative process. And so I started to design this sort of ants, bees, and trees philosophy. And I would share this with my students, a lot of design or MFA art, different kind of students, mostly design and art. And this, they've often said how much it really sticks with them and they can apply it to the way that they think about being a creative, because I think it humbles, creates a humility level within the art practice that I think AI is really kind of triggering for a lot of artists, and that let me just explain by going through the slides. So ants, bees, and trees. And I have this as a framework for two different lenses. We have the artist lens and the human lens. So we can apply this idea of an ant being a tree to both being an artist and being a human. And I did this by also using this Book of Symbols, which I really love. It's a book that shows us how to think about the things that we experience in our very mundane life, but also just everything that's around us and how it actually is a motif, a symbol for something deeper. And so ants. The spiritual meaning of ants, according to this book, is since antiquity, artists have chosen the ant to convey the virtue of industry at physical, psychological, and spiritual levels. Tiny ants embody the methodical, discriminating work that helps the psyche or soul to sort the seeds of her relationship to the divine. So my translation of that would be, ants represent community, multitude, labor, the micro. They work together to achieve a larger task. The small becomes the big. So when we think of this in a application lens, as an artist, an ant are your influences. So these are the people that you really admire and you bring into your work. You're very inspired by them. At a human level, anthood is kind of when you are a child, right? You're brought into this world. You don't really have that many options. Really, everything is kind of imposed onto you. You're very influenced by your immediate surroundings. Then we have bees. To the ancient Egyptians, the honeybee was the creature that transformed the warmth of the sun's rays into golden sweetness. A mere pound of honey requires about 25,000 trips between flower and hive and contains the essence of over 2 million flowers. My translation, bees represent a cross-pollination, so blending of different, and an alchemy, transforming one entity into another. So as an artist, you are a bee when you are creating. You've been inspired by all these different ants, and you are synthesizing them to create something. And as a human level, this is often kind of your college era, right? You have left your hometown or where you grew up, the place that has been so influential to your core understanding of the world. And now you're discovering all these other people and the way that they exist within the world. You're seeing how people dress and present themselves. You're seeing people talk in languages that maybe you've never heard before. Their mentalities are much different than your parents, right? So you're being exposed to something that's very different. Then we have trees. Spiritual meaning, the trees show us how from a tiny bare seed of potential, the self can come into existence centered and contained around which occur incessant processes of metabolism, multiplying, perishing, and self-renewal. Every sort of creature nestles in the tree's sheltering, motherly branches, hides in her hollows, and is fed by her substance. My translation, a tree symbolizes possibility coming to life, right? From that small seed to something huge, and existing for lifetimes, a home to philosophical imaginings and beyond. So as an artist, your tree, you went from an ant, you're bringing all these different people that you're inspired by, you're bringing them together as a bee, you're synthesizing them, and then you're creating this tree. That's the final art piece, right? And so now it becomes a home for so many other people to have a relationship to that art piece. They have a memory that they think of. Whenever they see your painting, they think of how they felt when they saw it, or it reminds them of a moment that they experienced. It becomes a home for others. As a human, who you are in this moment of going from ant to bee to tree, that's you, that's your current form. And so let's ground this even further. How did I use this in my practice? For a period of time, I was very interested in the way that Henri Matisse existed, right? And he, towards the later end of his career and life, when he was less mobile and in a wheelchair, he started to use paper, scissors, and glue to create his work, and really limited himself to just those things. And I wanted to think about, what if I did that, as a bee? I'm gonna be Henri Matisse for a day, and I'm gonna do everything that he's done and just see my relationship to it and see what I can create by following in his footsteps. And what it ended up turning into, my tree, the art piece, by synthesizing Henri Matisse's way of existing as an artist, I found that it was actually very enjoyable for me, of limiting myself to just paper, scissors, and glue, and creating my own piece that looks very different from him, but it came through me and everything that I understand about the world and looks a bit different. But this practice of limitation was very freeing for me, of not needing all these different, not leaving myself to all the different possibilities that I was doing when I was exploring AI, but really limiting the materials that I had access to and creating only from there. And so this idea of ants, bees, and trees, if we think of it as how it flows, again, it's this idea of smallness, right? That we are all ants. Everything that we're influenced by is an ant. And we're alchemizing, we're synthesizing different things, we're creating something, and eventually we manifest that into something. It becomes a tree. And that if we look at this, even if I kind of stack these ideas, I often kind of see shoulders as sort of, when people say they have a mentor, sometimes a mentor is something sometimes a mentor is someone you actually have a relationship with, or sometimes it's just someone you're inspired by. And so I see that as a bit of a shoulder. And you are blending all these different shoulders together. You're creating these ideas, you're making forms, and then you create this experience. And I felt like this was a way to really sort of encapsulate how what AI is doing with creativity is very similar to what humans have always done, right? But now it's at a computational scale. And I think one of the many reasons why artists have such apprehension towards it is because now we have entered a space where someone that has just uses a few words can create something that it took someone else 10 years to be able to create, right? But then that requires us to have a new metric for creativity. It's not just a one-off thing that we assess someone's capability. It's more of what's the consistency of their work. Are we able to recognize how what they've created radiates a certain energy? Can you see their work and be able to point it out and say, that's what this person created? I know it because of their style, right? And so this requires a lot of work. This requires understanding your own style, your signature, being aware of your upbringing, your culture, your way of seeing, and understanding that everything that you create is now being synthesized, has always been synthesized through you. And what makes your art, a metric for your art is being able to identify the energy, how it radiates into the world, how other people can see that it's from you, right? But yeah, let's hone in on this idea of you, understanding who you are and how you get this energy. So a lot of this work was me looking outwards into the world, and I realized that to understand who I am and figure out how do I get to my own energy, it's going to be a lot of looking inwards, right? When you point a finger, you're pointing one at the other person, you're pointing three at yourself. So I've done so much critiquing of the world, right? Of how society is flawed in all of these different ways, and how it's because of this AI system that it's be able to regurgitate those flaws and biases. But who am I? How do I use AI to understand who I am? And I think as an artist, that's the most important knowledge you can have, is to understand who you are, so you can create in a very intentional way. Act 2, Scene 1, Psychoanalysis. I created this entire residency for myself, a self-designed residency where I studied myself. So I went a little crazy and just had a lot of time to myself, lived very reclusively. But I understood that this wasn't a purely narcissistic thing, it wasn't completely self-indulgent, because I understand that who we are as a person is reflective of our society. Each of us individually are a microcosm to the rest of the world. So the better that you understand yourself, the better you understand the rest of the world, the better you can be in relationship with the rest of the world. And so what I did was I spread out a lot. I got this space, really wide space, and I just made a lot of stuff, all sorts of stuff. I bounded myself to nothing, no material, no aesthetic, no direction, no color palette. I did whatever, anything. And I think it's really important to spread very widely, because as I was telling, I had a few studio visits earlier today. As I was telling a few of the artists, you don't know who you are at this time, like you were figuring out so many things. And so you need a lot of data points to figure out who you are, right? And to create a reasonable graph of yourself. And so I was creating a lot of data for myself. And in doing that, I asked myself a lot of different questions, like what are my philosophies, right? What are my frameworks in existing in the world? How do I perceive the world? What are my values and belief systems? What do I think is good or bad? What am I drawn to? What am I inclined towards? What parts of my art practice have I undervalued? What are the patterns and threads within my work? I think this was one of my most important questions, and it's something that I've used a lot. Before I did this residency, I did a lot of modular synthesis. So it's this machine that you have all these knobs and you can create all these sounds using digital energy, electronic energy. And I would often attach it to my plants, and I would derive the energy from the plants, the electromagnetic waves, and use that to design my sound. But this was also a period of time where I was just experimenting and creating a bunch of stuff. But for me, experimenting always fell flat. It didn't give me a purpose. It felt like I was tapping into a lot of possibility, but I didn't know why I was doing what I was doing. And so at the time, I didn't realize that I was undervaluing something I was very interested in. I also started to think a lot more about what cages does my psyche exist within, and how do I exit them, right? So what are ways that I exist within the world, and I've only allowed myself to exist in that way, similar to the identity part, right? Of how have I said, this is how I'm supposed to be, this is how I'm supposed to dress and present myself, and not realize that that was just a story I was telling myself. What are my limits, shadows, insecurities, right? So shadows being a really big one of what are things that I think are negative about me, but shadows don't necessarily need to be negative. It's just a part of you that maybe if done too much, it can be harmful, but to think about your shadows and be more self-aware. And so overall, this was just a self-study of how do I understand myself as an instrument at a granular level, and so that I can have this clarity and intention, right? Think of yourself as an artist, And the fact that you're an artist, that is an instrument. The way that you exist within the world is an instrument, in the same way that Photoshop and Ableton and Final Cut Pro, those are all different instruments. The better that you understand any instrument that you're using, the better you can use it in a way that's very intentional and clear. And so I wanted to do that with myself. And I realized that a purpose for this overthinking was simulating, for one, a flow. I think a lot of us as artists, we really value flow state, right? When we're not thinking, when we can enter our studio and we know exactly what we want to create, or we just jump right into creating. But oftentimes before I did this practice, I would enter my studio, and because of infinite possibility, I didn't know what I wanted to create. There were so many things I could do, right? And so it kept me outside of flow state. I was constantly thinking. And I created this formula for flow of, once you have this accepted truth, once you define what your reality is, you now have a confidence. Confidence is what allows you to tap into flow. You're not thinking. Confidence I equate with just, you're not thinking. And you release that cognitive load, right? You're not overthinking. You're not trying to process everything. You're just doing it, and you enter flow. And so I had to figure out what my truths were. Another one was reestablishing my relationship to my ego. And so this could be a very personal thing, but maybe some of you resonate with this of, there's a way that we all have our different relationships to our ego, but ego is very much a part of the art practice of being an artist, right? And so for me, I think we all know that an ego is very much a stage within the art practice, the way that it's taught to us very traditionally, right? We know of Salvador Dali, who was like the embodiment of ego as a stage, right? He used his persona as a way to draw a lot of attention to himself. But I don't want to necessarily do that, and I'm a fan of people like Lao Tzu and a lot of ancient Chinese philosophy who teach more of, don't necessarily assert yourself. You don't need to keep proclaiming your brilliance and, amazingness. And I see art more as a spiritual journey. It's not so much of something I want validation for. It's a way for me to process the world. But we live in a capitalist world, so we have to figure out how to sustain ourselves. And so I had to figure out how to blend these two ways of existing and not think of ego necessarily as my stage, but it's a vehicle. Sometimes I'm gonna have to enter my Salvador Dali. Sometimes I'm gonna have to be very flamboyant and get a lot of attention, but I know that my purpose is simply so that I can keep accessing art as a spiritual vehicle. And then 3, I have a lot of existentialism within my practice of like, why are we doing what we're doing and why am I existing in this way? But I think that's a very human thing, and all humans need to create a sense of purpose. And traditionally, we've had a lot of different tools to create our purpose. Before, we were much more hyper-local. So it was our community, a very small community, that dictated why we are doing what we're doing. We had rituals, we had ways of existing. Art was embedded in every part of our life. It had a purpose, a very clear purpose. We've had religion be something that guides us and teaches us this is how we exist. These are our dogma. This is our truth. This is what's good, what's bad. And often, for most of the world, it's the workforce, right? It's their job that gives them this purpose and this sense of meaning and validity in how they use their time. But as an artist, it's very different. You have to create your own purpose. And so this creates a lot of existentialism, especially when we live in a world where access and possibility are infinite. We have technology at our fingertips. We see what everyone around the world is doing. It feels like nothing has already been done. Everything's been done. It gives you a bit of a pointless kind of experience, and we just have so much access to the rest of the world. And so it's important as an artist to find yourself amongst the noise, to make it less noisy. GPS signal loss, look at that, it's so interesting. Yeah. But yeah, it's just to hone in on how humans have always needed a sense of purpose. We've always had that. We've used myth as a way to create a sense of purpose. We use astrology as a way to understand who we are. We have branding that says this is my identity, and we use that to convey ourselves to other people. We've always done that, and we're always going to do that. And so for me, it was not necessarily overthinking. I'm just trying to validate my way of being, but it was more of me discovering my story, and I think that's very important within the art practice. So Act 2, Scene 2, Mythopoesis. I created an entire myth. So in that residency, what I did was, I'm gonna create a whole world for myself. And the way that I'm gonna do that is by creating 12 different archetypes. I'm gonna study, this is the way that I exist, and these are different tendencies of what excite me the most. I love design and I wanna explore it in this way. I love philosophy, I love science, all the things that have called out to me. And I created a bit of a motif around them. I turned them into this character in the way that myths often do. And now I can use these different characters in different ways within my art practice. Now, maybe when I enter a studio, I'm going to take the personality of Thoiso, who is the element of air, a masculine energy, very focused on thoughts and intellectualism and time. And if we think of him in a zodiac way, he would be a Gemini. Or sometimes I might be Oratori, who's very focused on communication and has more of a Scorpio nature and is feminine. And sometimes I can actually blend them. So what would happen if I blend Oratori and Thoiso? What would a conversation be like between someone who loves to just express and talk with someone who's very cerebral and in their mind, right? Like what would be created from them? And so this was a tool that allowed me to release a lot of that cognitive load. It created a container for myself. If I only have these 12 different archetypes, and I'm not thinking about all the possibilities because I have a limitation. And so I then turned these archetypes into something visual as another element to my art practice. So these are 5 of the 12 different archetypes. And then painted them. And so this was a practice of, for one, having a visual framework. Like I actually created these images in AI, and then I used those visual frameworks and then used pastel on these wooden canvases and painted them. And so that was another exploration of how does it feel to have a visual framework and then create from that. So another release of cognitive load. I'm not creating an abstract or painting that's just from my mind. I have something very direct to look at. And then I created this whole exhibition within my studio and invited people into this world that I had created, where I told them about this entire culture I designed. So I created 12 different archetypes. I created my own language, the importance of language. I created a cosmogram. I also was able to bring back in my love for using modular synthesizers with plants. And now that had a story within this world. And I'll go into that a little bit. But also, I'm generally someone who's very interested in ideas of enlightenment and spirituality. And so this world is also the cosmogram between the 12 different archetypes. It leads you more and more to becoming more enlightened and how to exist in the world that is both more self-aware, but also removes the idea of even needing to be self-aware. You just exist in a very Taoist way. And so this allowed me to have a different relationship to my work. Before, what felt like experimentation, which felt like I could go in so many different directions, it's infinite in possibility. Now I have a meaning towards it. Now the plants are actually one archetype, Seda, who is Mother Earth, and it's using sun, which is Soloro, another archetype, and then I'm also creating sound through the lenses of other archetypes. I have Etziata, who's all about experiencing art only in your inner world. It's not about being invested in how people perceive your skill. And so I blend these different archetypes to now create this work, which gives it depth. And for me, that's important. I need to feel like there's a reason behind what I'm doing, and I'm not just, doing whatever I want to do at all times. Another part of this was memory has been very important within my practice. And so me being someone my family comes from the Dominican Republic. And so a lot of our artifacts and cultural history is gone because of, things that have happened in the world that are very destructive. And so what I started to do was use AI in a way where I could fabricate more of my history. So I would grab images from the archive, put it into these AI tools, and create these images that allowed me to experience them in ways that I haven't seen them before, and think about what would be possible if I had access to these artifacts. What if I could use their structure to design other elements like chairs or jewelry. But a lot of my work, what I was doing was very inward and introspective, and it was also me paying attention a lot to what I intuitively was drawn towards, and understand that there's a lot of power in intuition. We often feel that we need to externalize all knowledge, but there's so much knowledge within us. And if we pay attention to what we're doing and why we're drawn to certain things and that intuition, that's very revealing. And so what I found a lot within my work was the intuition that I did within this practice was very much affirmed with the next part of this. Act 3, Scene 1, making the subconscious conscious. And so after this, I left my studio and went to University of Maryland to do a residency. And so here I had a lot of time in their archive, a lot of it around the African diaspora. And I also had access to motion capture technology. So I was able to use their systems and do whatever I wanted inside of that environment. And a lot of the ideas that I was intuiting in my previous work were starting to be affirmed by the archives of, it's interesting that I was drawn to this, and now I'm seeing that culturally that's what my people were doing, and I had no idea. And I'll give some examples in a bit. But yeah, it was time spent in the motion capture, and a big part of my interest has been what are the correlations between the way that we move our body and dancing and sound. Like, why do we maybe bob our head in a certain way, or move our shoulders, or move our hips to certain parts of the music? And is that something that's consistent across people? Is that a very cultural thing? And so I wanted to just use myself as a test subject and see what my relationship between sound was. And also in understanding that sound is such an important sensorial catalyst. And my theory has been that sound really, or a lot of senses, they really allow us to tap into memories that maybe we have not even lived yet, or have not lived ourselves, but it's part of our epigenetical DNA structure, right? So in listening to these sounds, a lot of what it felt like was happening was I was experiencing parts of my ancestral lineage just coming out of me, in the way that I was finding myself dancing and moving in a way that I hadn't been taught. And this is some research that I've done where it says part of what was powerful about the enslaved person's drums was not only its use as a cipher of coded messages, but its use as an abstract portal to a lost ancestry, to the spirits of previous generations, and as the glue that made members of a community feel connected to a common heritage. And so even as I explore this is something that a lot of people have been experiencing of, this seems to tap into something much deeper. There's something very deep between senses and our neurobiology. And many indigenous African languages have no word for music, and yet none lack one for dance, and none have only a single word for rhythm. And so this also made me think a lot about language, right? And what's been consistent within a lot of this of, we in a capitalist world, we're very invested in using sound and converting that into music, right? That's something that you can sell. But dance and rhythm are not as easy to sell in that same way, right? And so language, the way that we think of words, is very embedded within the value system, but that can mean something different across different value systems. And so let's actually back up. So what I did was, at University of Maryland, I would go inside their studio, and what I'm going to do is play a few different videos of me moving around, dancing inside the motion capture studio, and really just studying the relationship between my body and dance. But how are we on time? Because I haven't looked at the clock. And yeah.
4:50.
Okay, 10 minutes. Not bad.
Only you the best for me, I know nobody matter more. Nobody, hey, nobody. It be like I don't win a lotto. I know if you cool it down more. Baby girl, I'm whiskey, on holiday to Mozambique. Follow me, go to Mozambique. Baby girl, are you on your way? She make a bring helicopter.
So this is me converting my movements into these 3D designed characters. And I'm very drawn to 3 characters. I don't know, that seems to be like a aesthetic thing. Like if you watch a lot of TikTok videos, it's usually not just one person. I think it like makes it look better when it's 3 people. But that's also part of the myth that I've been building of these 3 central energies, feminine energies, and so it's representative of them. But this felt like a whole new relationship to my work. This was not so much of me trying to create rigid structures and replicate that, though I enjoyed it because it allowed me to enter a form of flow where I wasn't thinking. This was completely freeform and using purely my intuition. There was no choreography. I'm just listening to music and moving however I feel like I should move. So it created a whole new relationship that I really enjoyed. And it was really just me trusting myself. And so again, that's a level of confidence that comes from giving yourself that permission, you know? And I think that's, it creates a different experience to your art. It also, with the work, the paintings that I created, with them being based off of these AI-generated images, even though I did a lot of work to make them how they looked, it was still through a technology that is very culturally embedded into a certain kind of culture. And so a lot of the paintings, they do have a very Eurocentric idea of beauty. And I wanted to create work that was much more tapped into my own culture. And so by removing that technology and using myself as a conduit for my cultures, and using technology as an augmentation of myself, as opposed to technology being the what allowed me to access my culture. So this is a bit of my process, and what I was doing initially was dancing to music. Now I wanted to study, what if I created music based off of my movement?
This beat was bubble gum, so I had to chew it.
Taste me how to duck. Taste me how to duck.
Tenía que ser un hombre. No lo dejes, no me trates de engañar.
So I mixed all those different samples together and then created this.
Oye, mami, tienes unas caderas que parecen carretera, y en este día de lluvia cualquier cosa puede.
And I only play a little bit of it, but an interesting part of that was my family being Dominican. We share a lot of similarities in lineage as Puerto Ricans. And part of the Puerto Rican practice with sound is this idea of bomba, where the drummers actually drum to the dancers, and they make their music based off the dancers' movements. And so that's another one of those intuitive explorations that I'm doing, but actually I'm finding are affirmed by studying my own history. And another part of this practice was that it felt like, again, this big returning to my roots of I've grown up loving to create music. I've grown up loving to create film and design. And I was finding that I was naturally bringing all of those things together in a way that really solidified how I've existed and gave more purpose to what I was doing. And so those are my ants. The things that I did and loved as a child were surfacing, again, as I'm creating new work. And so finally, I'm at this tree, Cosmiage. So this has been the latest work that I've been creating, and this is from a lineage of my entire life of exploring things, and it finally feels like I'm finally in a moment where I'm able to blend all these things in a way that feels very seamless. And cosmiage is a word that I created that brings together the word cosmos and lineage. And so this is about how, in using dance, I'm discovering so many parts of myself, intuitively getting connected to my lineage, but also understanding that all these senses that we interact with, they allow us to access memory and experience of our ancestral lineage to as far as the stars, to the beginning of existence. And this is something a lot of different philosophers and theorists have explored, this idea of a memory that is consistent across any sentience that can exist along its lineage. So I'm gonna play just a last excerpt of Cosmiage, and then And so what I'm doing is I'm blending all these different genres of music together across the Pan-African diaspora, and then arranging them to my own movement. And things that I'm bringing in are different motifs and cultural elements across the diaspora. So stereo systems in Jamaica have been very influential in us having access to so many genres that we have now. It was because of these stereo systems, sound systems, that reggae became something that could exist within popular culture, because before it was very political to have certain music distributed. It was only done through the radio, which was, very gate-kept. And so I'll wrap up last few seconds with this Act 4, Scene 1, The Skies Even Higher Than the Trees. And this book that Colin mentioned of black metal, presented by Afrodictopia, which is this organization I created when I was a student about 6 years ago at NYU. And I created this incubator between MIT Media Labs, Space Team, and NYU for a group of artists to reimagine space travel, but through a very speculative lens. And it's this book that's currently for sale at afrodictopia.org. Little plug if anyone wants to buy it. But it's a book about a new protocol to space. So we don't think of space travel as this very typical destination from Earth to maybe Mars, but it's more about the interpersonal journey. Who are you when you go on this voyage, and who do you leave as? Like, what version of you do you leave as, and who do you become? And how can you create yourself to be this best version of yourself? How can you become more aware of who you are? And how do you, design a way of existing that's very healthy for you? It's a new pedagogy for self. I'll only share my chapter, which is Celestial Florilegia. And so again, this taps into my love of plants and me thinking beyond what's possible in today's world and on Earth, but creating these plants that have a whole different relationship to our senses and our ways of existing. And it's also a tool to understand yourself through a spiritual lens. So I turned them into a spiritual tool where you can create your own koan, which is a very Zen Buddhist message that guides you. And so these are some images from that. And so credits, takeaway from all of this. The way that you see the world is very special. And it's really important to understand that. And I think education oftentimes really tries to make you feel like you need to see the world in a certain way. And this is my favorite example of driving this idea home, is Octavia Butler's work on slime mold. Octavia Butler was not a scientist, not a traditional scientist, but she allowed herself to be a scientist. She studied slime mold and didn't project the way that we exist as humans onto it, our own idea of sexuality and gender and those sorts of things. She let it be what it was, and she let it tell her what it is. So she created a whole different pronoun, unicellular, for these objects, and she studied them in a way that was much more freeing than traditional scientists had, and she actually influenced the way that they understood slime mold. And so I love this example because it shows how we often feel like we need to be trained in a certain subject to have our contribution seem valid, but it's the fact that you might not know about something in a trained way that allows you to see possibilities and influence people that are trained. Limitations create concentrated possibility. We live in a world that's very infinite. We have access to everything, and it's going to increase. And so we can easily get overwhelmed, and that is how I've loved to create these sort of containers within my own practice of only using a certain material, only operating from certain archetypes, reflecting on how ancestral communities only had but so much, and yet it was so robust. Pay attention to what you take for granted. I grew up loving sound, cinema, design, dancing, and it's only now that I'm recognizing that I loved all those things and that it's valid for me to bring them together and create something from it. So the things, and I think I didn't understand that because what you enjoy, you often think other people enjoy. You don't realize how it's very unique to you. And so thinking a lot about what you're interested in, understand that that's you, that's an individual thing, and that there's something special in that. And you as an artist are an instrument. Study it. Design a world around you. You don't have to fit yourself into the world. You can design a world that fits you. And if you're like me, the journey might be the actual art. So I think this whole presentation was art. There was no final piece of art, right? They're all just byproducts. So enjoy, especially as a student. You have so much pressure that you can often apply to yourself. Just enjoy every little bit. And the privilege of a lifetime is being who you are. Thank you. If we have, that would be great if we have time. Yeah, I would love to. Okay. Yes.
Thank you so much. I have a question that goes back to something you said near the beginning of the talk, and I just wondered if you could unpack it a little bit more. You said that written language, in this moment of AI, written language now has visual synonyms, and I was just thinking, like, has language always had visual synonyms? What's sort of different about the relationship now? I think you sort of said some,
Yeah, I like that, that you're exploring it in that way. Visual synonyms, I would say, is now we have a word like Gothic, and all of us could have an idea of what Gothic is in our minds, but to have a tool that translates it in a way that we're all accessing that tool, it creates a visual synonym in that way. But I think words have always had visual synonym, but I think oftentimes it was kind of a mental thing, or someone would paint it from their individual perspective, and now we have a tool that's more centralized in creating that relationship. Yeah.
I'm curious. I love dance and I love art, but I never think about converging the two. What kind of granted you permission to kind of move towards that?
I give myself permission. Yeah, I don't think I've ever. When I was younger, there were things that I didn't let myself do because I felt like I needed to be trained. But I think I also, for the most part, if I want to do something, I'm going to do it. And I think it's really important for everyone to give themselves the permission to explore their own curiosity, and not feel like you have to operate at a certain level or be validated by certain people, but give yourself the permission. Yeah. Yes.
Thank you for the presentation. I love everything you said. But I have a quick question. As an artist, do you ever struggle with, especially now with social media and the internet, with because I've always seen the internet as such a great tool for research and informing and finding your taste. A lot of the things that pieces of media and stuff like that are important to me. I feel like I have discovered through the internet. But at the same time, I feel like, especially recently, it's really hard to with all the algorithms and stuff like that, with TikTok, and even Pinterest, something that's highly aestheticized and catered towards you. It feels really challenging to draw the line between what's really your intuitive, what's coming from yourself, and what's coming from the algorithm. So do you have any routines that you do to help you kind of distinguish the two?
Yeah.
And filter out what's coming from yourself?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's one way I would answer it in that when I did the residency, I really removed myself a lot from as much of society as I possibly could. So very recluse, not on social media, just really trying to, but looking at books. So it's not that different. It's not an algorithm, but I am being exposed to things. So trying to remove as much as I could, because I know that everything is influencing, or also it's being more careful of what I'm letting myself consume, because that's also your diet is everything. It's not just the food that you eat, but everything you're listening to, everything that you're experiencing. But then it's also understanding that that's who we are. We are humans and we are synthesizers, and we are always going to be influenced. And you can't live a life with your eyes shut and your ears closed. You're going to be influenced by things. And so I think that's where the ants, bees, and trees come in, is that we have to be, I would say humble, not in that what you're saying is not humble, but that to understand our own humility, that we're just creativity is very collective and we're influenced by so many things. And I think oftentimes artists can feel like their idea came from them. And it's no, you actually got that idea from so many things that you brought together, and it came through you, as something else. Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. I was fascinated by this process that you described and the relationship between research and the actual artwork.
Yeah.
Because to go back to your last point, you talked about the journey as the artwork itself, and the artworks as a kind of byproduct of that. So I would like to hear more about this kind of, is it a reversal of the process, or how do you see these two phases?
Yeah. I think it's just so interconnected, and I jump between the two. There's the art practice, but that comes always from research. It could come from literal books where I study, or studying different disciplines, or it could just be that I'm someone who pays a lot of attention to everything. Even I'm probably going to reflect on this entire experience, and it's going to be in my dreams, and something about this is going to influence me in some way. It's being aware of how aware we are, and that everything that we are exposed to can be a tool of research, and then it influences my work. And then what I often do is use myself as kind of this germ on a petri dish, and I'm studying the way that I exist. And so now I create something, but now I'm researching what I created and how I created it and why did I create it. It's the overthinking, So I think it's just constantly bouncing between the two, of redefining the idea of research too. We can often think that research is purely external. And I think for me, I'm exploring how research can be very intuitive and internal, and how research tools can take many forms. We think we need to use these scientific tools, but maybe your body can be a research tool for ethnomusicography and the way that, and studying the way that you move and how it relates to different genres. So it's just kind of expanding the idea of all of that and creating my own formula. Yes.
In the ants, trees, and bees, you had the artist like with it was like all inside of each other.
Yeah.
And the human was more spread out.
Mm-hmm.
Can you explain more why you represented it in that way?
Sorry for all the flashing. Yes. Okay, so why I represented the ants, bees, and trees all inside of each other. Like that?
What about the artist makes it all interconnected, and what about the human experience makes it more linear?
Yeah. Human, I could have used either one to represent either. I think the way that I was thinking about it though is it's like just baby and you keep growing, growing, growing. So I'm thinking of that more as like a linear experience. So starting off as this ant and you keep growing and blossoming and becoming bigger in both size, but also mentality and awareness of the world. And then artist, I see that as you're an artist at any age, and it's not necessarily size oriented, but it's more of a concentric circle layer oriented. So at your core, that's what your ants are. That's what has influenced you the most. And then you synthesize different things that have influenced you deeply, and then you create. So for me, it just feels like more of a radiating relationship, and it doesn't feel as linear as a human lifetime does. Another one? Yes?
Okay, it's a little bit more of a comment than a question, but I want to thank you because I am kind of a technophobe. I feel like I'm also old, and I've been really freaked out by AI. I teach here, and I have a pretty dogmatic approach to trying to have my students not use AI to teach humanities courses. And part of the rationale that I've had about it is that I'm not sure what the vantage point is. That like if you're not, I'm always wanting my students to kind of speak from somewhere and to kind of have a situated perspective, which I think your work is very much about that kind of a process of situating your perspective. And I've seen AI as really a threat to that because I'm like, I don't know where that place is from which you're speaking, which perspective it is. So it's super interesting to see your practice is using it as an instrument to almost further situate or understand your situated perspective.
Yeah.
So it's got me thinking a lot.
That maybe you'll let students use AI.
I'm not sure about that. Because I am old and maybe stubborn. But yeah, it's interesting that you're using it as a tool almost to kind of, in a way, you're countering that relationship.
Yeah. Thank you.
Great. That's a great point.
Thank you.